Funding for the Hinckley Report is made possible in part by the Cleone P. Eccles Endowment Fund.
Tonight on the Hinckley Report, the nation witnesses a historic inauguration, and voters indicate their top priorities for federal and state leaders. The legislature meets in a closed Capitol building amid a pandemic and worries of civil unrest. And Utah's new governor outlines a plan for his first 500 days in office. Good evening, and welcome to the Hinckley Report. I'm Jason Perry, director of the Hinckley Institute of Politics. Covering the week, we have Emily Means, political reporter with KUER, Chris Bleak, lobbyist with RRJ Consulting, and Scott Howell, former Utah Senate Minority Leader. Thank you for being with us tonight. It's just so many interesting things to get to. I want to start with you, Scott, though. We had a transition of power into the White House with our new president, Joe Biden. You were part of the campaign. You were part of the transition. Talk about that event through the Utah eye. What are we going to see from President Biden as Utahns?
Well, first of all, it was historical because instead of a field of people, you had a field of flags. And it really set the tone for what the president was wanting to do. And I think through the lens of Utahns, probably the person that stole the show was Amanda Gorman. Her poem about climbing the hill I think touched the heart of every single Utahn. My son texted me and said, "Dad, I think we're at General Conference." And I thought that was kind of an interesting comment. But I think the president had said from day one, and as short of 2 weeks ago, we had a conference call with the Biden team and with those involved. And they said, COVID-19, COVID-19, don't even approach us about anything else unless you have a solution and a better plan. So I think from the lens of Utahns, we're going to see an individual that won't be tweeting at 3 in the morning, won't be sending out messages, but someone who's thoughtful and caring and will want to have unity. Now, he realizes that there are people, 70 million, that didn't vote for him, but he also realizes that we can come together. And I think on the pandemic, making that the #1 issue is probably as important as anything, and I think that's what Utahns will want to see. Because once we get back to our normal lives, is what we quote normal, I'd say, things will be better for everyone. But you know, we've learned a lot from the pandemic too. We've learned about being mobile. We've learned about working not in an office. We've learned about how we can communicate. So there's a lot of things that the president will focus on, but that is going to be top of the list.
Yeah, I want to get to a couple of those items, but Chris, one interesting thing visually from it was our entire delegation was there. Even Congressman McAdams, former Congressman McAdams, was there as well. This is a group of people that were not really supportive. You know, some of them even talking about the election being stolen itself, but they were all there. Talk about the symbolic nature of their attendance, and particularly given the lens that even Burgess Owens wrote a letter saying, "I'm going to work with the administration."
Well, I think that's the right thing to do, and I'm glad that they did that. I wish some of those actions would have been reflected earlier, but it's a positive sign, it's a positive trend. It's going to be a challenge. I mean, inaugurations generally bring people together. There is a honeymoon period, so to speak, but this is a difficult time and one that's going to require a great deal of deft touch that I think is, you know, that President Biden certainly has, and it'll be interesting. But he's going to have some pull from his different factions and interest groups, those that want him to move in a more progressive direction, those that say more incremental. And so it will be interesting to see how much he reaches out, how he goes about doing that, what kind of personal touch he puts on it. And I think that people should be open to receiving that and working with him and working with his administration as he's willing to find common ground and work with others.
So I'm curious about this, Emily, because you're covering so many of these stories so well. And I'm curious what you're hearing, because even as we heard from both sides of the aisle really here today, they're all talking about unity. They're talking about coming together, bipartisanship. What do you think that means now from the people you're interviewing? Because I know you're talking to legislators every day too. What are people thinking that means?
Well, I think it's a good question and something that we'll just really have to see what that even looks like. I want to go back to Representative Burgess Owens and Chris Stewart, who both voted not to confirm those electoral college votes. So that particular message from Burgess Owens that he will work with the Biden administration towards common goals or whatever. Some things that I'm seeing is that maybe that rings a little bit hollow. And, it was just a couple weeks ago that we saw the insurrection at the U.S. Capitol, which was largely spurred by this idea that the election was stolen. So I don't know what unity looks like. I don't know that we can move past what happened just a couple weeks ago so quickly. And I think another thing that I'm seeing is that it can't all be on Biden's shoulders to do that. Though I do think, I think, Scott, you mentioned this, that Biden has kind of been seen as one who will unify the country. But, it kind of takes two to tango. So I'm interested to see how the Republicans and Democrats come together and, what their respective roles will be in that.
I read a quote, don't know who said, I apologize. So they made the point that it's exhausting to debate reality, it's energizing to debate policy. And so I hope that is what we can see. I think that a broad conflict of ideas is appropriate. I don't expect, Senator Lee just to say, oh, well, we'll just do this because, Joe Biden wants to do it or Chuck Schumer wants to do it. I think it's appropriate that they debate policy. The question is, can they find a place to land and pass something that's impactful to the American public? And that's where I think the debates and the frustration is really growing, is Congress has to act. And at some level, I don't even care what it is anymore. Let's find a way for them to act and move policy forward for the country and for the good of Americans.
When you get to this policy, Scott, I have to ask, because there's a Utah flavor that they're looking for in President Biden. And just give us the take on the fact that on the very first day, one of the couple of the executive orders get to some issues that are top of mind for Utahns when it comes to Bears Ears, for example, the oil and gas drilling leases. Also talk about that.
Well, I will talk about that. I want to make a point what Emily said. Look, they're not going to go in and sing Kumbaya. When you talk about civil discord, you can also have civil dialogue. And what Chris said is very appropriate. The ability, and I've been in those positions, where you have to sit down and listen. And there's a big difference between tweeting out insurrection and tweeting out these messages of battle and contentious versus someone who can get in a room and be able to sit down and have adult conversations. And it should be no surprise to Utahns. Joe had said this from the beginning. We know it's a fact. They were going to talk about Bears Ears and about the realignment of some of the boundaries. At least look into it. That's what it says. And for me, that's not a surprise for everybody. And I don't know who didn't get that, but he said that every time he's been up there is one of his initiatives. I think on the other issues that we'll see that could hit home to Utah is the whole notion of education. He has always said that education is the driver that will equalize everyone in opportunities in their life. And so I think from that perspective, Utahns should be happy after hearing Governor Cox the other day put education at the top of the list. So I think there's a lot of synergy. And I'll tell you, on Bears Ears, if I was Spencer Cox, I would enlist Gary Herbert to be one of these individuals that will start to work to come up with a solution. Year after year after year, we go back and we say, okay, the boundaries are here. They're going to do this. We got to get President Nez involved. We've got to get the whole nation, the Navajo Nation, involved. And it needs to be this table where people are coming together and saying, what is the best for everyone? And I know Mike Noel. I've met Phil Lyman, and I know that they sometimes are perceived of being these people that you just can't make any progress with. It's my experience in working with them, if you sit down and have rational conversation, they'll at least listen. And so I think the best thing Spencer could do, as I said a minute ago, is enlist Gary and get them to go back there and sit down and have a rational conversation and make this issue go away, because there's no use doing it, Chris.
No,
right?
I agree 100%. I think that's the right message that there is. We look back at the Washington County Lands Bill that Senator Bennett and Representative Matheson did a number of years ago. We don't hear the talk and the debate around that for a couple reasons. One, it was negotiated with a lot of different players at the table. And number two, it was passed into law. Yes. And so if we want to do executive actions and just govern that way, then we'll just move presidency to presidency, administration to administration, and we'll just change that. That's not good for anybody. So yeah, I do agree. I think that those players down there want to be involved, and if the administration will bring them to the table, I think things can be solved, and then we can put it to bed and stop arguing about it.
Okay, go ahead, Emily.
Yeah, I did want to mention, I mean, to be fair, President Trump undid Obama's Bears Ears designation through executive order, and Utah leaders applauded that. So I know there is this ongoing tension between Utah and the federal government, and executive orders are not the ideal way we like to see things done, but sometimes, you know, I guess if it's the right thing for state leaders, it seems to be all right. But Scott, to your point, I think it's important who is sitting at the table when they're discussing these monuments and these public lands issues. President Biden has appointed Deb Haaland, the first Indigenous Secretary of the Interior. And so I think that having her here and discussing these issues will kind of change the dynamic a little bit.
Oh, that's a good point, Emily. Although she calls herself a 25-year or a 25-generation New Mexican before she puts the connotation of it indigenous. But I think you're absolutely right that having a leader like that will make a difference in what we're going to do. Because from what I've seen of her, and I don't know her, she is pretty much engaging and wants to work together and create win-wins.
Let's talk about the win-win for a second. It's something you mentioned a second ago, Scott. But Chris, talk about this point. We recently, the Hinckley Institute of Politics with the Deseret News just completed a poll, and one of the questions was about what Utahns think the #1 priority should be for President Biden. And without question, 40% of Utahns said it's the vaccine distribution. All right, this is the one thing that Utahns, and the other ones are pretty far seconds. This is the #1 thing. How important is it for President Biden, in your mind, to get this one right? And what does that mean for the rest of his agenda?
Yeah, I mean, right or wrong, despite the struggles and challenges that have been left in his lap, it is the area that's going to define his presidency. If we can't get the vaccine fixed and rolled out and into people's arms, then it's going to be a disaster, and we're going to continue to see the problems that we've seen, and so that is absolutely priority #1. And I hope that he can, because I think it's in the best interest of all of us as Americans, from an economic standpoint, from a health standpoint, from just the well-being of our children being in school. I mean, we're all looking forward to being back to normal, whatever that means. And so, absolutely, I want him to get it right, and I think everybody does. And he needs to get it right in order for this country to thrive.
Yes. Some Scott has suggested, and I think it's true, that this is the unifying message. If you want to talk about what that is this is a shared concern for everyone. Every political party said this. So talk through your lens as an advisor to the president also in so many ways, how he should be advancing that cause and Utah in the country, and how that might bring some of our own delegation a little closer to him.
Well, the first thing that he did was he brought Dr. Fauci back. And Dr. Fauci made a great comment. He says, it's great to be in an administration where I'm told, if you don't know the answer, make something up. Biden said, if you don't know the answer, say, I don't know the answer. And be that clear. And I think you've seen with Jen Pekaski, the press secretary now, how frank they're going to be in this. And the president does have a plan. 1 million shots a day and getting 100 million doses out in the the first 100 days. But there's some underlying things on there, and Chris alluded to this with regards to wearing a mask. Some of the things we need to do as citizens of this country in order to stop the spread. And you hear time and time again, just that simple thing of washing your hands and wearing a mask can help delay that. But I'm thrilled that the president believes and understands that we've got to get our kids back into the classroom. That, to me, sends a message to everyone that he understands the power of education. And Chris is exactly right, that if we don't do this right, that will be the demarcation of, oh, he failed at the very beginning.
Okay. I want to get to some state politics for a second, but Emily, just one more on the federal side, because with this change in having a new president, President Biden, I'm curious how this is going to change the interactions and really the approval numbers for our own delegation. Again, using the Deseret News poll we just did, I just want to throw out a couple numbers really quick and talk about how our two senators are going to play in this administration. Senator Mike Lee, 45% approval in the state, 41% disapproval. But of course, I have to mention with the Republicans, he's at 69%, totally fine with his own party. But Mitt Romney has a 50% approval, but he's mostly doing well with everyone but his own party. All right, talk about the dynamics for both of those two players on the national stage.
I think that Mitt Romney has really stood out, over these past 4 years as someone who will speak out against the leader of his own party, right? We haven't seen that from a ton of Republicans during Trump's administration. But I think, I was tuning into the show last week and someone mentioned that Mitt Romney is really truly a conservative. He just was not a Trump fan. So I'm interested to see how he will respond to some of Biden's policies. Although, Biden is a pretty moderate Democrat. He's not wildly progressive. So that will be interesting. And maybe Romney will come back up as someone who is perhaps more accepted by his Republican colleagues and Republican constituents now that he is kind of playing that role with the Democratic president. So I'm not quite sure about Mike Lee, though. I would be interested to hear how Scott or Chris thinks Mike Lee will interact with Biden.
Yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see. I mean, Mike, the interesting thing about Senator Lee really does want to see the Senate function. I know that he cares about big ideas. I know that he cares about working policy the right way. So I have heard him talk about him being hopeful that a 50-50 Senate allows for regular order, allows for the committee process to work. And I think he truly means that and believes that. Now, with that being said, Mike is a conservative. There's no question about that. And he's going to come with that lens. But he has shown, I mean, you've worked with him, I've worked with him, he's shown that he's willing to be pragmatic and thoughtful about big ideas. And so I'm hopeful that he'll continue that way. But he's got I mean, if I had those numbers going into my election, I would be happy. More likely than not, there's going to be a little bit of a whipsaw, if you will, towards the Republicans, and so Mike's probably in a good spot there, but has some work to do. Mitt, he doesn't even have to worry about it. He doesn't have to run for re-election for a long time. Lots of time for those numbers to move up and down. So.
Yeah, for sure. Let's get to some of our local elected officials. I want to start with the governor, Governor Cox. Scott, we got the state of the state last night. All right. Any key takeaways from his first speech? It was short because he was trying to keep people safe and minimize the time together. Any key takeaways from that speech?
Well, I really appreciate the shortness in that. I compare him to Bill Clinton, who always took more than double the time on everything he did. And I love Bill, don't get me wrong, but I thought Spencer sent a message again that we have to be careful, we have to be serious. There is one thing that's very puzzling to me when he said, "I'm your friend, but I'm going to veto a lot of your bills." If I was in the legislature, I'd
which
go,
you were.
Yeah, which I was. I would say, how many crappy bills do I have that you're already on the list? And I haven't gone through the bills. Probably Chris has gone through them a lot more than Emily has. But there must be a lot of bad bills up there for him to fire that warning shot across the bow. And then I love Stuart Adams. Well, we're all good friends, and that's just part of the process. Dang, that wasn't part of the process when I was there, if Mike Levitt or John or Norm Bangerter had said that in the opening remark, I would have gone, am I doomed? Should I go down right now and say, is this over? So
yeah, Emily, talk about that. You were covering the speech. I know you were there, because that is something that seems to stand out. There's a call for unity and some of the top issues, but wow, that's a little bit of a shot from one of his former colleagues, right? He used to be a member.
Yeah, that was really curious to me as well. I was like, oh man, what's coming up that's so bad? And he also said specifically that he might veto more bills than his predecessors had. So that was interesting to me because, Governor Gary Herbert's relationship with the legislature, they were always butting heads. And I don't know how many bills Herbert vetoed, but Spencer Cox is going to veto more than that. I thought that it was a weird way to kind of set up his relationship with the legislature going forward. But, we heard a lot of the same sorts of things that Spencer Cox mentioned on the campaign trail. He talked about unity, like we've mentioned, a huge theme of his during the campaign and over the past few weeks. He talked about education, talked about getting through the pandemic. So I feel like I didn't hear much that was new from Spencer Cox, but definitely I appreciated his brevity in his little 15-minute speech.
So talk about this in perspective. Chris, I want to hear you. Former Chief of Staff to the Speaker of the House was a position you held, former legislator. When the governor gives a speech like this, are they worried? Are they scared? Or are they just like, oh yeah, it's go time?
No, they're not. I think it was a great speech. I think he did a number of things really well. I loved his talk about equity in education and the way he compared that using the graphite rod and versus a stick and string. I thought he weaved some really beautiful analogies in there, and I give him credit for that. At the end of the day, governors have not typically vetoed a lot of bills. Most of the bills that get done are done on a really, I'll even say bipartisan basis, but they're cleanup, they're technical. So what does he mean by I'm going to veto more bills, or I'm going to look more towards that? It'll be an interesting thing. Is he trying to put a line in the sand saying, you need to come to me, I need to be more involved in policy, or I'm going to do that? Or is it going to be, no, do your thing, but I'm just going to put a marker down and veto more bills? It'll be interesting to see how he does that. I would hope that what that means is you need to consult with me. We need to have more conversations about the policy perspective at the beginning and not just expect me to rubber stamp it at the end.
Good point. Do you have anything on this, Scott?
Yeah, well, one of the most poignant moments in Holt's speech was when he talked about this great teacher who sacrificed, and then he said, it's my brother. Wow, that sent a message to me that this guy really does understand education. And I know he promised that he'd increase the WPU, and when you look at his budget, as Chris knows, the governor sends a budget and the legislators go, oh, thank you, we'll see you later. But I hope that they'll all come together, because education is the key. And that was a really great moment when he told people, now, I know education inside out because my brother's a teacher.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and it's important to note, and I want to give credit to President Adams and Speaker Wilson, it could be easy for them to throw not only his budget out the window, but that speech, and just say, you know what, if he wants a fight, we'll take a fight. That's not the approach they're taking. Right. They deserve a lot of credit for, the way that they've conducted themselves. They have been strong in making sure that we're balancing health and economic interests and balancing even getting school children back in. So I give them a lot of credit. They deserve credit as well. It's a three-headed monster in that regard, and they have to work closely with one another in order for it to function properly.
Mm-hmm. Well, we are ending the first week of the session, and so to that aim right there from these legislators, I'm just curious, any bills you're seeing that are going to start dominating the headlines or already becoming interesting in the state? Emily, what are you seeing from your perspective there? I know you're on the Hill.
Yeah, well, I'm on the Hill virtually, Jason.
Yes, me too.
Stuart Adams said 2021 is the year of the tax cut, and we have already seen the state Senate pass the first tax cut legislation, which targeted retired people's income. So that's just the start. There's still, like $40 million more is set aside for tax cuts. So that's something that I think will be a big theme this year. Another thing that I'm watching out for is police reform legislation. And we have seen a lot of bills already, mostly stemming from protests over the past year against police brutality and racial injustice. So I think those will provide a lot of fodder for discussion and debate, and that's something that I think we really need to keep an eye on this session.
I'm going to watch those close. Several themes in there. But Scott, you're working on a specific one. We've got lots of viewers down in the southern part of the state of Utah. You're working on a bill.
Well, as a proud graduate of Dixie University, we should have changed that name.
Of Dixie State University.
Like Emily said in our pre-conference here, we should have changed that 20 years ago. And why we haven't changed that, this is not about doing harm to the culture. This is not doing harm to, if my aunt's name is Dixie, it's not showing disrespect. What it is showing that we are in the 21st century and that racism, and I'll quote Dallin Oaks, racism has to end. It was that simple. And I think connotations of that Dixie and what it means, we have to end that. And so to my legislative friends, this is an issue for each graduate down there. When they go to apply for a job in New York City and their recruiter says, tell me about, does this say Dixie? Did you misspell this? Or tell me about Dixie. That's hard. And we have to end that. And you know what? To my good friends in St. George, it's a cultural change, and it's going to happen, but it will happen for the best of your kids and your grandkids and your great-grandkids.
Well, it's so interesting. Not many people know that for a name change like that, it does require, Chris, it requires the legislature to approve. Yeah. And this is an issue that's been since you were working in the legislature.
Yeah, and I think it'll be interesting to see. I applaud Dixie for the way they've engaged the grassroots and have talked about some of these issues and the impacts it has on their graduates. I'll just note, I think one of the important issues, the legislature often we focus on these big issues and that generate a lot of headlines. They're planning to spend a lot of money, both one-time money and bonding, on infrastructure. And they're talking about roads, they're talking about transit, they're talking about active transportation, they're talking about fiber. This is the benefit that's going to have for Utahns for generations.
Well, it's so interesting. We're going to have to end with that. But certainly as we look at the end of the session, when there's a lot of money, one-time money in particular, the decisions become even harder, it turns out.
I can tell you from experience, it is harder to appropriate one-time money than it is full-time.
Yeah, true. Thank you so much for your insights this evening. And thank you for watching the Hinckley Report. This show is also available as a podcast at pbsutah.org/Hinckley Report or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you for being with us. We'll see you next week.